The rain came sideways across the parking lot behind the all-night diner down by the Providence waterfront, and the woman in the cream-colored uniform had already lost one shoe. Two men had her by the shoulders, dragging her toward a white van with no plates parked across the exit, its taillights bleeding red into a puddle slicked with motor oil. She dug both heels into the wet asphalt and left two long streaks behind her, hair plastered to her cheek, the shoulder of her uniform torn clean open. She wasn't screaming. She had stopped screaming a long time ago, because she had learned that in this city people hear everything, and people close their windows anyway. Elias Marchetti stepped out of the black car at the top of the lot, no umbrella, in no particular hurry, letting the rain hit him full in the face as though it had nothing to do with him. 36 years old, a name half of Federal Hill wouldn't say out loud at the dinner table, and he had pulled in here for nothing more than a cup of coffee. He raised the pistol to eye level, index finger laid flat along the frame instead of on the trigger, the habit of a man who had never needed a second shot, and he said exactly 4 words, quiet enough that the rain nearly swallowed them, clear enough that both men heard. The only shot fired that night went into the van's front tire. It let out one long sigh, and the vehicle sank at the corner like an animal going down on its knees. The men let go and ran off into the rain, leaving the woman to collapse onto the cold asphalt. Elias lowered the gun and prepared to do what he always did with strangers he happened to save: hand them a coat, call his driver, and forget them before the car reached the main road. But she lifted her head, and that look was not the look of a woman who had just been rescued. It was the look of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment, who had planned every step of it, and was only now watching it arrive. She looked straight at him, still shaking, and said his name. All of it, including a middle name no paper in Providence had ever printed. Then she reached into her soaked uniform and drew out a yellowed black and white photograph of a pharmacy storefront he had walked past every single day for 36 years, taken long before he was ever born, and turned it over so he could read the line written there in ink gone soft with age. Your grandfather signed his name on a dead man. If this story reaches you, leave a like, drop a comment, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of this road with us. He didn't ask who she was. That was the question any other man would have asked first, and that was precisely why he didn't ask it. Elias opened the rear door of the black car, stepped back, and waited until she decided for herself whether she was going to get in. She did. Water ran from her hair onto the leather seat, leaving behind a dark stain shaped like a hand. He sat down across from her, closed the door, and at once the sound of the rain seemed to retreat into the distance, as though someone had drawn a heavy curtain between them and the rest of the world. The driver looked into the rearview mirror, waiting for an order. Elias gave the slightest shake of his head, and the driver immediately turned his eyes back to the windshield and didn't look again. Inside the car, there was nothing but the steady sweep of the wipers moving back and forth, and the breathing of someone who had just run as hard as she could. He held the photograph between 2 fingers, angling it toward the streetlight filtering through the window, just enough to see that the paper had curled at all 4 corners and gone soft through the middle from being folded and unfolded too many times. Then he asked, not her name, not who the 2 men were. He asked how long she'd been carrying that photograph. She looked up, and something very brief passed over her face, the expression of someone who had just heard the exact question she'd prepared an answer for long ago, yet still couldn't quite believe anyone had finally asked it. She said her name was Marin Rowe. She said the photograph had been in her family longer than she'd been alive, tucked inside a tin cookie box she hadn't opened until after her grandmother died, and from that day on it had always stayed hidden in the lining of her coat, because she didn't dare leave it at home and didn't dare let it out of her reach. Elias listened to all of it. He had a habit of letting people finish, not because he was patient. He'd never been a patient man, but because he'd learned very young that when someone finally decided to speak, interrupting them was the fastest way to make sure they never spoke again. He asked what she'd been doing in that parking lot at that hour. She said she worked the night shift at the diner. He asked how long she'd been working there. She said 3 months. Then she added one more sentence, in a voice so calm that it took him several seconds to understand the full weight of it. She said she'd taken the job at that diner because he came there once a week. The car went silent. Elias lowered the photograph onto his lap very slowly, and for the first time in years he felt something whose name he had almost forgotten. It wasn't anger. It was the feeling of a man realizing that while he'd been busy watching an entire city, someone had been quietly watching him, and had been doing it better. He went over his own routine in his head. He never took the same route 2 weeks in a row. never gave advance notice, never let anyone except his driver know where he would stop. And yet she'd been sitting there for 3 months, pouring his coffee, clearing his table after he left, and waiting. He asked why she hadn't said anything during those 3 months. Maren looked down at her hands, at the faint old scars across the backs of her fingers, then said that during those first 3 months, she hadn't been trying to speak to him. She'd only been watching. She needed to know what kind of man he was before she handed him the only thing she had left. She said she'd seen him leave a tip larger than the bill for a waitress who was crying in the kitchen without asking why she was crying. She also said she'd seen a man walk into the diner looking for him, then walk out afterward, and that man had never come back. She said both of those things were him, and she had no intention of pretending only the first one was true. Elias didn't answer that. He said the driver would take her home. Maren shook her head. She reached for the door handle, and he realized she had planned for this moment too, just as she seemed to have planned for everything else. She said she didn't want anyone knowing where she lived, including him, at least not tonight. Then she pushed the door open. The rain rushed in at once, splashing across his sleeve, carrying with it the smell of wet asphalt and the sea from the harbor. She stepped down onto the cold pavement with one bare foot, straightened beneath the streetlight, and spoke her final words through the still open door, loudly enough to rise above the rain. She said that if he wanted to know the rest, then with what he already had in his hand, finding her shouldn't be difficult. Then she turned and walked toward the far end of the parking lot, not running, not looking back, with the stride of someone who had walked through the rain far more often than anyone had ever offered her a ride. The funeral home on Federal Hill had a room in the back that was never used for anyone's viewing, and every man who walked into it the next morning knew that before he arrived. The room smelled of old flowers and candle wax, the kind of scent that had seeped into the walls over generations and would never leave again. 30 men sat or stood around a long table, covered in wine-colored velvet, divided clearly into 2 sides like 2 currents of water refusing to merge. On the left were the Vollmer men, who controlled 3 docks on the north side. On the right were the Kilbride men, who controlled 2 docks on the south side and a cold storage warehouse that both families wanted. The dispute had dragged on all summer. 2 trucks had already been burned. 1 man had been forced to move to another state, and both sides knew that if it lasted through another season, something would break that no one would be able to put back together. At the head of the table stood a high-backed leather chair left empty. No one sat in it. No one pulled it out. It remained there through the first 20 minutes, like a question the entire room was waiting to have answered. Then the door opened, and Elias Marchetti walked in wearing a black wool coat, his hair still damp, carrying nothing in his hands. He looked at the empty chair, passed it without stopping, then leaned against the wall beside the window and folded his arms. He didn't sit. The 30 men in the room understood at once that the meeting wouldn't be long, and not one of them said it aloud. The Vollmer side spoke first, then the Kilbride side. Each talked for about 10 minutes, offering numbers, dates, and verbal agreements made in their father's time that no one had any papers left to prove. Elias didn't interrupt once. He listened with the attention of a man waiting for a song to end so he could turn off the radio. Then a man seated on the Kilbride side, a large man in a leather jacket that still looked new, slammed his palm against the table and began speaking loudly about who deserved what and who had spilled blood where, his voice filling the low-ceilinged room with complete confidence. And for exactly 3 seconds he was the only person there making any sound. Elias didn't change his posture. He asked only one question, no louder than an ordinary speaking voice, almost gentle, asking whether the man remembered who had put up his bond in the spring of the year he got out of prison. The man went silent. Then he sat down, pulled his chair close to the table, and didn't say another word until the meeting was over. No one laughed. No one turned to look at him. That silence carried more weight than any threat that could have been spoken in that room. Elias settled the matter in 4 sentences. The cold storage warehouse would go to the Kilbrides because they had paid the electricity on it through 4 winters without anyone noticing. The 3rd dock would go to the Vollmers because Vollmer's father had built it with his own money. Both sides would split the unloading fees on the frozen freight route, and if one more truck burned anywhere in the city, Elias would decide for himself who owned all 5 docks. No one objected. Both sides stood and shook hands across the table with the expressions of men who had just been rescued from something they themselves had created. Elias pushed away from the wall and headed for the door, then stopped. An older man was sitting in the corner, someone who had driven freight for the Marchetti family since Elias's father was still alive, and Elias stopped in front of him. He asked whether little Delaney was doing better, whether the fever had broken, what the doctor had said. He remembered the girl's name. He remembered the hospital, too. The older man stood, his hands trembling slightly, and said she was better but still needed more appointments. Elias took an envelope from inside his coat, placed it in the man's hand, and told him not to let it drag on. Then he stepped outside. In the hallway, Augie Marchetti was waiting with 2 cups of coffee, one for Elias and one for himself, just as he had every morning for the past 15 years. Elias took his cup, looked through the glass at the wet gray courtyard beyond it, then said the name Marin Rowe. He said she worked the night shift at the diner by the harbor, had dark blonde hair and an old scar across the back of her left hand, and he wanted to know who she was, where she lived, and who had paid the 2 men from the night before. Augie nodded, took a sip of coffee, and said it wouldn't take more than 2 days. Augie came back after only a day and a half, sooner than the deadline he had set for himself. And that alone should have made Elias pay attention. But there are things people only learn to see after they have traveled far beyond them. Augie placed a file on the desk so thin it was almost empty, and said she was clean, no criminal record, no significant debt except an unfinished student loan. She waited tables on the night shift, took temporary work during the day at a contract laboratory on the outskirts of the city, and lived alone in a rented apartment on the 5th floor of an old building east of the railroad tracks. No one was behind her. No one was paying her. The 2 men that night had probably been nothing more than a robbery gone wrong, the kind of thing that still happened around the harbor after 11 at night. Augie said all of it with the bored expression of a man who had just wasted a day and a half on something that amounted to nothing, and he didn't lie about a single thing. He simply left a few things unsaid. Elias picked up the file, turned 2 pages, then set it back down. He asked whether she had mentioned the Marchetti name to anyone. Augie said no, and Elias gave his order in a single sentence, without raising his voice, without explaining, in the tone of a man crossing one line off a list. Make her disappear from this city. No pain, no noise. Just put her on a bus and make sure she never comes back. Augie nodded, folded the papers, and left the room. That should have been the end of the story. But that night, instead of letting his driver take him back to the estate, Elias drove himself. He told no one. He brought no one with him. He parked a block away from the building, walked through the fine mist left behind by the rain 2 nights earlier, and climbed 5 flights of stairs because the elevator had a notice taped diagonally across its doors that had been there so long the ink had faded. He didn't ask himself what he was doing there. There are things people do first and only understand 20 years later. Marin opened the door without looking surprised at all, and somehow that bothered him more than anything else. She stood in the narrow opening with a dish towel still in one hand and said she had told him he would find her. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. The apartment was smaller than he had imagined. A tea-colored water stain spread across the ceiling from one corner almost to the middle of the room, the mark of one rainy season laid over another, something the landlord had never bothered to touch. A paper calendar was taped to the refrigerator, the kind pharmacies gave away for free, and 4 squares had been circled in red ink, heavily, over and over. The kind of circles made by someone who had stood in front of that calendar more times than she wanted to admit. Beside it sat a plastic pill organizer with 7 compartments for the 7 days of the week. Elias noticed all of it in less than the span of a breath. And before he had time to put a name to any of it, the bedroom door at the end of the hallway opened. A little boy stepped out, about 6 years old, with tousled blonde hair, wearing pajamas covered in green dinosaurs and socks that didn't match. He rubbed one eye, then looked Elias up and down, with the open curiosity only children possess, a gaze with no suspicion in it, only the simple desire to know. Then he turned to his mother and asked if this was the man who had come to fix the faucet, because the kitchen faucet kept dripping, and he had counted 32 drops while brushing his teeth. Marin laughed, a short, genuine laugh, and said no, this man was only stopping by for a little while. The boy nodded as though he understood perfectly, then asked Elias whether he knew which dinosaur had 3 horns, and before Elias could answer, the boy supplied the answer himself in the voice of someone deeply satisfied to know something an adult didn't. Elias stood there in the little kitchen that smelled of lemon dish soap and listened to a 6-year-old boy lecture him about dinosaurs. Then the boy lifted a hand to brush back his hair. His sleeve slipped down, and Elias saw a stainless steel medical bracelet around his thin wrist. There were words engraved into the metal. He read the first name before he even had time to think. It was the name of a drug, And he knew that name because he had seen it printed in his own company's quarterly revenue reports no fewer than 30 times. Marin took the boy back to his room, tucked him beneath the blankets, turned off the light. And when she came back out, Elias was already saying that he had to go. He walked down 5 flights of stairs, reached his car, sat motionless behind the wheel in the darkness, then called Augie. He said only 4 words, "Cancel today's order," then hung up before anyone had time to ask why. He came back the following afternoon, this time not to look but to listen, and Marin seemed to have known he would, because 2 cups of coffee were already waiting on the kitchen table, with a faded canvas backpack placed neatly beside them. The boy was downstairs with Mrs. Roz, the neighbor in her 60s, who had a spare key and a habit of knowing everything that happened in the building without ever asking a single question. Marin pulled the backpack toward her, unzipped it, and turned it upside down over the table. She didn't take out one thing. She emptied everything, and papers spread into a thin layer across the wood. They were letters. Elias leaned closer and looked. There were 4 letters printed on the letterhead of 4 different law offices in Providence and Pawtucket, none longer than 3 paragraphs, all using nearly the same language, saying that after a preliminary review, the office had determined that the matter fell outside its area of expertise, and that they wished her luck in finding more suitable legal representation. One of the 4 letters even misspelled her name. The 5th was different, longer and more enthusiastic, from a small office on the north side that had agreed to take the case and scheduled her to come in and sign a retainer agreement. Beneath that letter was a 6th from the same office, sent exactly 8 days later, informing her that because of a change in the direction of the practice, they were forced to terminate their representation and that her entire retainer had been refunded. Elias picked up the letter and read it twice. 8 days. Not 8 months, not after the case had run into trouble. 8 days. Then there were 2 printed email chains sent to 2 newspapers, one in Providence and one in Boston, each sent 3 times at 3 different points, and neither had received a single line in reply. Marin stood across the table with one hand resting on the back of a chair and said she had done everything an ordinary person was taught to do. She had gone to the authorities. She had looked for a lawyer. She had knocked on the doors of the press. She had sat in waiting rooms where the air conditioning was too cold, and the chairs were upholstered in leather, chairs she never dared sit all the way back in. And she had learned something no one had ever taught her, that some doors weren't locked. They simply didn't open for people like her. She said it had taken her half a year to understand why. Then she told him why she had come looking for him, plainly and without circling around it, saying that the only person in the world who could give this back was the person who was holding it in his hands. Elias didn't answer. He sat down. Marin pushed the stack of letters aside and took a square tin box from the bottom of the backpack, dented at one corner, the kind of butter cookie tin people gave one another during the holidays. Its lid printed with a summer garden faded so badly that only the windmill could still be made out. She opened it and began telling him about her grandmother. Her name had been Dorothy Fenn, though everyone in the neighborhood called her Dot, and she had raised Marin from the time Marin was 7. She had worked in a laundry for the last 30 years of her life, standing beside a steam press from morning until night, coming home with both hands red and the smell of starch clinging to her hair. She never spoke about the work she had done before that. She never spoke about the tin box either, because for 40 years it hadn't been kept in the kitchen. It had been hidden behind a loose panel inside the cupboard, a panel Marin had leaned her back against 1,000 times while sitting on the floor eating real cookies, never knowing what lay on the other side of that thin piece of wood. She found it only after her grandmother died, when she was dismantling the kitchen before giving up the apartment. Then, she slid a sheet of paper toward Elias, yellowed to the color of tea, a copy of a patent application, and Elias picked it up. He didn't need to read the whole thing. He only needed to read the name of the compound on the 3rd line, because he had read that name in his own company's revenue reports, and because he had read it again the night before, engraved on the steel bracelet around the wrist of a 6-year-old boy who had been lecturing him about dinosaurs. Then his eyes moved to the line listing the inventor, Ezra Fenn. The kitchen fell silent. Outside the window, a freight train passed along the tracks, making the cups in the sink touch softly against one another. Marin didn't sit down. She stood there with both hands braced against the back of the chair and delivered the final sentence in the calm voice of someone who had practiced saying it many times in front of a mirror. She said she hadn't come there to ask him for anything. She had come to give him back the name he was carrying. Elias didn't ask Marin another question that night. He took the copy of the application home, And the next morning, he called someone he hadn't spoken to in more than 2 years. A woman who worked in the county land records office. Someone the Marchetti family had once helped with her mother's hospital bills. He didn't ask her to do anything illegal. He only asked her to trace the chain of title for an address on Atwell's, the address the entire city knew as the first Marchetti pharmacy, the place where his grandfather had started everything, the place that appeared in every family photograph, hanging along the halls of the estate beneath the same caption. This is where it all began. She called him back 4 hours later, and there was something hesitant in her voice that he recognized immediately. She said the chain of title didn't begin with his grandfather. One owner before him, the property had belonged to someone else, and it hadn't been registered as a store. It had been registered as a compounding facility and residence. The owner's name was Ezra Fenn. The transfer had taken place after his death, through an estate liquidation process, with no heir coming forward to contest it. Elias sat motionless for a long time after the call ended, his hand still resting on the telephone, because he had just understood something none of the papers in that pile had ever said plainly. His grandfather hadn't only taken a formula and a name, he had taken the house too. Everything in this city that carried the Marchetti name, every store, every warehouse, every contract, every dinner served in a dining room beneath painted portraits, all of it had risen from the very foundation of the man whose name had been erased. That night, he called Marin and told her to meet him on Atwell's before sunrise. She arrived before he did, standing beneath an awning across the street, with both hands buried in the pockets of a coat too large for her. The street was still empty, except for a garbage truck passing by and the sound of its tires rubbing across pavement damp with morning dew. The pharmacy had been closed for years, its windows papered over from the inside with old newspapers, the wooden sign above the storefront still hanging there even though nearly all the lettering had peeled away. Marin looked up at the facade for a while, then said quietly that Dot had never once taken her down this street, and now she understood why. Elias didn't answer. He looked down at his feet. The threshold was a slab of ivory white marble, thick and as wide as the entire doorway, and in the center of it ran a shallow hollow shaped like the bottom of a boat, worn down by too many footsteps over too many years. He himself had stepped across that stone more times than he could count in all of his 36 years, first as a child with his father holding his hand, later as a grown man walking alone, and not once had he ever considered that a slab of stone could also be a lid. He took a crowbar from the trunk of his car, worked the tip into the gap along the right side, and pressed down. The old mortar cracked into dust. He pressed again, putting his full weight onto the steel bar, and one corner of the marble lifted with the dry, scraping sound of stone grinding against stone. He shoved it sideways, and beneath it was earth, dry earth that had never seen sunlight, and buried in that soil was a rectangular block of metal, dull gray, unusually heavy for its size, a lead film box, the kind laboratories in those days used to protect film from radiation. Elias pried the lid open with the tip of a key. Inside were 3 things: a roll of photographic negatives wrapped in wax paper, a typed transfer document with 2 signatures at the bottom, which Marin lifted toward the streetlight and then immediately went silent, though she said nothing about it then, and a handwritten letter, folded into quarters, the paper turned brown along the creases. Elias opened it beneath the beam of a flashlight. Then he began to read aloud, slowly, for the woman standing beside him, in the middle of a street where no one else was awake yet. Ezra wrote that he wasn't afraid to die, that he had lived long enough to understand that death was only a door everyone would eventually have to walk through. He wrote that what kept him awake through so many nights was another fear, the fear that his name would disappear before he did, that people would keep the formula and leave the man behind, that children would live because of something he had created, and no one would ever tell them that it had once come out of a basement room, from the hands of a man who had nothing except time and stubbornness. He wrote that he wasn't asking for money, wasn't asking for credit, wasn't asking to be remembered. He asked for only one thing, that if someone ever found this letter, that person would have enough courage to do what he no longer had the strength to do. Elias stopped reading there. He stood on the sidewalk with the paper in his hand, and for one long moment, the man half the city didn't dare name over dinner couldn't find a single word to say. Marin didn't look at him. She looked down at the shallow patch of exposed earth beside the overturned stone, and said that Dot had lived only 40 minutes away for 40 years, and she had never come back here once. The roll of negatives was the thing that left Elias helpless, and he understood that the moment he picked it up, he had enough money to buy almost anything in this city, and enough people to send anywhere he wanted, but he had no idea how to open a roll of film that had been buried underground for decades without having it crumble in his hands. Maren was the one who took it from him. She held it between 2 fingers by the edge of the roll, never touching the surface of the film, and told him not to take it to any Photoshop because gelatin film stored for too long in high humidity could fuse to itself, and all it would take was one impatient person pulling too hard to destroy everything. She said she could do it, but she needed a place to work. The contract laboratory where she picked up temporary shifts was in the industrial district on the west side, a row of low buildings roofed in sheet metal, and she had a key to the side entrance because she was often the one who had to come in early to calibrate the machines. They arrived just as dawn was beginning to break. Elias leaned against a steel table in the corner and watched her work, and during that half hour, he saw a Maren Rowe completely different from the woman who had stood in the rain with one bare foot. She put on gloves, tied back her hair, and moved through the room along a path her body remembered without needing thought. She mixed a gelatin softening solution in a glass beaker, lowered the roll of film into it, timed the process with a stopwatch on her wrist, and every so often tilted the beaker to see whether the layers of film were beginning to separate. She didn't speak while she worked. This was the one thing in her life no one had ever sent her a rejection letter for, and perhaps that was why she handled it with the solemn care of someone paying back a debt. When the film finally loosened enough to unroll, she hung it from a line with 2 clips, let it dry, then laid it across a light table and bent over it with a magnifying glass. 6 frames on the entire roll were still readable. 5 showed equipment, stands, a system of glass tubing. Things Maren said were documentation photographs of the process, the kind people took to prove what they had made and how they had made it. The 6th frame was entirely different. It showed people. She adjusted the focus, then stepped back and made room for Elias. In the frame was the storefront on Atwell's, photographed from the sidewalk, and the marble threshold was still new, with no hollow worn into the center. Standing to the left of the door was a man of about 50. Thinning hair, wearing a short-sleeved lab coat, both hands in his pockets, standing upright in the way of a man posing in front of something he had built with his own hands. It was Ezra Fenn. To his right, about 1 step away, stood a thin teenage boy in an oversized shirt, holding a cardboard box against his chest, his head lowered slightly under the weight, and he was smiling, the kind of smile worn by a boy of 15 or 16 after an adult had praised him for being strong. Elias stared at that frame for a very long time. Then he reached out and touched the glass of the light table where the teenager's face was, and he didn't lift his hand away, because he knew that nose. He knew that jawline, the way those shoulders sloped slightly forward. He had looked at it throughout his childhood from behind the driver's seat, and he had seen it for the last time in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic, when the man had aged 40 years, but that jaw was still the same. It was his father. Maren said quietly, almost apologetically, that the young man in the photograph was carrying merchandise, and the name of the store was printed on the box, which meant he had worked there. Elias didn't need her to say it. He already understood. His father, the man who had taught him only 2 things his entire life: that a signature mattered more than a promise, and that you should never let another person see you hesitate. The man who kept an oil portrait of his own father hanging in the dining room and made the entire family eat beneath it every Sunday night. That man had once been a skinny boy delivering boxes for Ezra Fenn. His father had carried those boxes up the very threshold that would one day bear his family's name. His father had known him, not through stories, not from files. His father had stood beside him, close enough to share the same photograph, close enough to remember the sound of his voice 40 years later, and not once in his entire life had he ever spoken the name Ezra Fenn to his son. Warren Kessler's office occupied the top floor of a glass building overlooking the bay, and Elias had sat in that room no fewer than 100 times, without ever noticing that there wasn't a single family photograph anywhere in it. There was only glass, a long walnut table, and behind Kessler an entire expanse of gray water stretching all the way to the horizon. Kessler was 66 years old, with silver hair combed straight back and thin framed glasses, and he poured water for Elias before pouring his own, just as he had since Elias was 15, and his father first brought him up there to learn how to read a contract. Elias placed the copy of the patent application on the table and pushed it toward him. Kessler looked down at the page for less than 3 seconds before raising his eyes, and what sent a chill down Elias's spine wasn't what he said afterward, but the fact that he didn't look surprised at all. He didn't ask where Elias had gotten it. He didn't ask why. He simply removed his glasses, wiped the lenses with a cloth, and said he had often wondered how long it would take before this came back around. Then he denied nothing. He said yes, the name on the original application was Ezra Fenn. He said yes, the man who signed the transfer papers had been so weak at the time that someone had to steady his hand. He said yes, the lawyer who handled it was his father, and he had succeeded his father. And Elias was sitting there because Elias had succeeded his own father, and all three of them were doing exactly what the men before them had left behind. Elias asked why he wasn't denying it. Kessler put his glasses back on and said denial was for people who still needed to be loved. Then he turned to the money, not to boast about wealth but to boast about technique, and in 3 short sentences, he said something Elias would think about through many nights afterward. He said the original patent expired. Everyone knew that, but no one was required to let it die alone. He said every time expiration approached, a new improvement was filed, a different formulation, a slower release mechanism, a dosage protocol altered by a few percentage points, and each one of those bought several more years. He said that man's formula had fed 3 generations of the Marchetti family, and it had done so under 6 different names, none of them his. Elias asked if he knew how much that medication currently cost per month. Kessler said he knew down to the exact dollar, and then he did something Elias hadn't expected. He turned the entire matter into arithmetic. He said there were currently 2,300 people across the country alive because of that drug, and every one of them depended on a single production line, because the disease was rare, because no one else was willing to spend the money to build a plant for a market that small. He said if someone dragged this into the light tomorrow, the federal authorities wouldn't applaud that person's courage. They would do the first thing the law required them to do: suspend the facility's license pending investigation. He said the production line would stop, and it would stop for months. And during those months, those 2,300 names would be left to fend for themselves. Then he leaned forward and asked Elias, in an almost gentle voice, how he planned to restore the honor of a dead man when the price would be paid by people who were still alive. Elias didn't answer. He stood, and when he was halfway to the door, Kessler called after him, not loudly, with the sentence Elias would carry through the rest of that season. He said Elias still thought he had inherited an empire. What he had inherited was a ledger of debts, and Kessler was only the man keeping the books. Elias stepped into the hallway, and when he reached the elevator, he stopped before his hand even touched the button, because he had just remembered a detail he should have noticed the moment he sat down. During that entire conversation, Kessler had never once asked who had given Elias that paper. It wasn't because he didn't care. A man like Kessler always cared. He hadn't asked because he already knew. He had known the name Marin Rowe before Elias even knew she existed, and he had sat there in silence all that morning, watching him, waiting to see how far he had gotten. They found the younger of the 2 men from that night after only 3 days, and they found him in the simplest way in the world, by asking who in the city had replaced the front left tire on a white truck in the early hours of that morning. His name was Deke, somewhere in his 30s, thin, with closely cropped hair, a man who hauled freight for hire and took off the books jobs whenever someone called. No one tied him up. They simply told him that someone wanted to talk, and he understood enough not to ask another question. The repair shop sat at the end of an alley behind the freight station, its concrete floor stained with oil, the smell of burned rubber and cold metal clinging to the air itself. A single lamp hung loosely from the ceiling above a wooden workbench scarred with black grease. Elias arrived later, alone, took off his coat, draped it over the back of a chair, and sat down across the table. No one closed the shop doors. The rolling door remained wide open to the alley, daylight still outside, and that was what frightened Deke most, because he understood that people only left a door open when they weren't planning to do the kind of thing that required it to be shut. Elias placed 2 things on the table. The first was a thick brown paper envelope, left unsealed. The second was a one-way bus ticket to Harrisburg, departing on the late afternoon run that same day. He said nothing for a while. He simply pushed both items toward the center of the table, directly beneath the circle of light cast by the hanging lamp, then leaned back. Deke looked at the envelope and the ticket, then at him. Elias said he could take both, or he could take nothing, but if he was still in the state by the following week, the man who came looking for him wouldn't be Elias. Deke sat motionless with both hands on his thighs, and Elias watched his jaw tighten and release several times before he finally opened his mouth. Then he talked. He said he was only the man who had been called in, that he didn't know the face of anyone higher up, that he received jobs through a phone number and collected cash from the mailbox of a laundromat. Elias asked how they had found her. Deke said he had heard from the other man, the older one, that she had gone knocking on the doors of several law offices around the city. The first 3 had turned her away politely. The 4th had taken the case. And that 4th office had someone who had worked with the Kessler family years ago, and all that person had to do was pick up the phone once. Deke said it with the expression of a man who saw nothing unusual about it, and perhaps in his world there truly wasn't. Elias asked what they had been given besides her name in order to find her. Deke slipped a hand into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulled out a wrinkled sheet of paper, folded into quarters, and placed it on the table. Elias opened it. It was graph paper, the kind torn from a notebook, and written across it was Maren Rowe's work schedule, handwritten in detail, precise enough to be frightening. Her night shifts at the diner by the harbor, which days, what time they started, what time they ended, her temporary morning shifts at the laboratory in the Western Industrial District, which days she walked, which days she took the bus, and which route she used. There was even a note saying that on Thursdays she came home earlier than usual. Elias stared at the paper, and everything around him seemed to go quiet. Not because of what was written on it, because of the handwriting. Small block capitals, perfectly even, the horizontal strokes slanting slightly downward toward the right, every letter E formed with 3 separate strokes instead of one continuous motion. He had looked at that handwriting for 15 years on message slips left across his desk, on the fronts of envelopes, on inventory lists. He had seen it that very morning on the note placed beside 2 cups of coffee. Elias folded the paper very slowly, following the same 4 old creases, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. His expression didn't change. Deke was still talking from across the table, saying something more about the phone number and the laundromat, but Elias was no longer listening. He stood, put on his coat, and before walking out, tapped 2 fingers against the envelope and the bus ticket, reminding Deke that there was only one departure that afternoon. Then he stepped into the alley, stood beneath the late afternoon sun, and for one very brief stretch of time he considered every possible explanation, and every one of them led back to the same person. Ruth Abernathy had a 2-room office on the 3rd floor of a building in Pawtucket with no elevator, and she made both of them climb the stairs because, as she put it, anyone who couldn't make it up 3 floors wouldn't make it through a lawsuit either. She was 63 years old, had spent 17 years as a federal prosecutor, and now took the cases no one else was willing to touch. She listened to Maren speak for nearly an hour without writing down a single word, holding a pen between 2 fingers and occasionally turning it once around. When Maren finished, Ruth set the pen down and said 3 things. First, she would take the case. Second, she needed everything inside the tin box, not copies, not retellings, but every scrap of paper, no matter how small. Third, and she looked directly at Elias when she said it, nothing in those files was to be taken into any courthouse in this state. No filing here, no complaint registered here, not even a mention of it over lunch with anyone who worked inside the county courthouse. She said she had lived in this state long enough to know that there were files submitted in the morning whose contents were known by someone else before the afternoon was over. She said this case had to go straight to federal court, and it had to go once, cleanly, with no draft left behind anywhere. That afternoon they returned to the 5th floor apartment and began sorting everything. Maren emptied the tin box onto the tablecloth, and the 3 of them sat around it arranging the papers into small stacks. There were receipts for chemicals. There were notebooks filled with pencil entries. There were 3 photographs of a room with a laboratory bench, and at the bottom of the box, flattened beneath a layer of yellowed lining paper, there was a black plastic cassette tape with no label. Only one line written in blue ballpoint pen along the plastic edge. For Maren, when you're old enough, Maren picked it up and sat motionless for a very long time. Mrs. Roz downstairs still had an old cassette player tucked away in a cabinet, and she brought it up, plugged it in, then quietly went back to her apartment without asking a single question. Maren placed the tape inside, pressed the button, and for the first few seconds there was only the hiss of blank tape moving through the machine. Then someone cleared her throat very close to the microphone, and the voice of an old woman rose into that small kitchen. She said she didn't know whether the machine was working, that the girl at the electronics store had shown her which button to press, but she had already forgotten, and that if anyone was hearing this, then it meant she had done it right. She said she was sitting in the kitchen, that it was raining, and that she had meant to tell Maren this story no fewer than 100 times. always thinking tomorrow, next week. When the girl was a little older, she said she had put it off for 40 years, and now her hands shook too badly to write anymore, so she would have to say it instead. Then she began. She said that back then she worked in the basement laboratory with Mr. Ezra, washing equipment, recording numbers, mixing solutions as he called out instructions. And he always called her Miss Dorothy, even though she was only 19. She said he was the kindest man she had ever known, and also the most stubborn, and when those two things lived inside the same person, they usually didn't lead anywhere good. Then her voice slowed, and she told them about the night at the hospital. She said he had already been terribly weak. She said she had gone to visit him that afternoon and, on her way home, turned back because she had forgotten her scarf. When she reached the end of the hallway, she heard voices inside his room, not nurses, but men, 2 of them, speaking very softly and very patiently. She said she stood outside that door with her hand on the handle, and she heard paper rustling, and she heard Mr. Ezra say no 3 times, each one weaker than the last. Then she said the sentence the entire kitchen fell silent to hear. She said she stood there for a very long time, and she didn't open the door. She said she was 19 years old, that she had no one in that city, that she was renting a bed in a room she shared with 3 other girls, and that she had thought if she went inside, she would lose her job the next day, and she had been afraid. She said she walked home through the rain that night, crying, and promised herself that in the morning she would go back and tell someone, but by morning, it was already too late. Then her voice caught for a while, and there was the sound of something being set down on a table. She said she wasn't asking anyone to forgive her, because the only person who had the right to forgive her was gone. She said she only wanted to say she was sorry. She apologized to Mr. Ezra for standing outside that door, and then she said she was sorry to her granddaughter too, the child who hadn't even existed yet when she stood outside that room, whose name no one knew yet, whose life no one could have imagined. She said she was sorry for leaving her a tin box instead of a story properly told while she was still alive, and for making her carry the burden she herself should have carried when she was still young and strong. The tape ran for a few more seconds, then stopped. Marin didn't make a sound. She simply folded forward, covered her face with both hands, and her shoulders began to shake in the silence of the kitchen. Elias said nothing. He didn't tell her it was all right, didn't say her grandmother had done the best she could, didn't offer any of the things people usually say because silence makes them uncomfortable. He only reached across the table, placed his hand over hers, and left it there. Ruth Abernathy called the next morning and told both of them to bring the paper they had found beneath the threshold to her office, the typed page with 2 signatures at the bottom, the one Marin had held up beneath the streetlight that morning before falling silent and saying nothing. She had remained silent about it ever since, and only now did Elias understand that her silence hadn't come from failing to notice what was there. It came from having noticed it already, and needing someone else to confirm it before she could allow herself to believe it. Ruth spread the page across her desk beneath an old desk lamp with a green glass shade, put on her glasses, then pulled out a document magnifier. She read the first line, the declaration identifying the parties, then the description of the compound, and then she stopped for a long time at the bottom of the page. She said this wasn't a transfer document. She said what they were holding was a declaration submitted with the patent application, the kind of document an inventor had to sign to affirm that they were the true creator of the invention. And she said there were 2 signatures at the bottom of that declaration, not one. The first signature was Ezra Fenn, slanted handwriting in black ink, written with a fountain pen. The second sat directly beneath it, smaller, neater, written in blue ink, with the name printed clearly beside it so no one could misread it. Dorothy Fenn. Marin didn't reach for the paper. She simply sat down in the chair across from Ruth and stared at it from the other side of the desk. Ruth continued in the same even voice of someone who had spent 30 years reading legal files, explaining that under the rules of that time, and under the rules today, anyone who signed that declaration as a joint inventor had directly contributed to at least one claim of the invention. She said no one signed a document like this because they had washed equipment or taken notes for someone else. They signed it because they had conceived part of what was written there. Then she opened the official patent filing, the copy Marin had found in the tin box, and placed the 2 documents side by side. On the official version that had actually been submitted, the line identifying the inventor contained only one name. Ruth pointed to the blank space beneath it, the empty space where a second line should have been, and said nothing more. She didn't need to. Elias stood against the filing cabinet, and stared at that blank space, thinking about the fact that someone had once sat in front of a typewriter and deliberately chosen not to type a name. Ruth said this wasn't nearly as rare as people like to imagine, that in pharmaceutical chemistry at the time, hundreds of women worked in laboratories under the title of assistant, and they mixed compounds, took measurements, kept notebooks, and almost never appeared on patent records because they didn't have degrees, and because they were women, and in those days either reason was considered enough. She said their names weren't always removed out of cruelty. They were removed because no one thought there was any reason to preserve them. Maren still didn't move. Then she reached out very slowly, pulled the paper toward herself, and rested one finger just above the blue ink signature without touching it. She knew that handwriting. She had seen it all her life, on the backs of birthday postcards, on school absence forms her grandmother had signed in place of her mother, on notes taped to the refrigerator reminding her to eat dinner. The letter D was formed with a loop that never quite closed at the top. The letter F had a horizontal stroke that extended farther than it needed to. The same hand, separated by 40 years, signing one document that would help save thousands of lives, and another reminding a 7-year-old granddaughter not to leave the soup on the stove too long. She sat that way for a very long time, and no one in the room said a word. Then she spoke a single sentence, almost in a whisper, saying that her grandmother had stood beside a steam press for 30 years. Ruth took off her glasses and set them on the desk. Outside the window came the distant sound of car horns from the main road, and a bus pulled to a stop before moving on again. Elias looked at the woman sitting there with the tip of her finger hovering no more than a hair's breadth from her grandmother's signature, and he understood that dot had been erased twice. The first time by someone sitting at a typewriter in a law office, the second time by Dot herself, through all the 40 years that followed, because she had come to believe that no one in the world would ever sit down and listen to a woman who worked in a laundry talk about chemical formulas. The call came in the middle of Thursday afternoon, while Maren was sitting in the hallway of the outpatient clinic waiting for her turn to receive the results of her routine tests, and the number on the screen belonged to the specialty pharmacy where she picked up her son's medication every month. She stood, walked to the window at the end of the hallway, and listened. The person on the other end was a young woman speaking quickly and very politely, the kind of politeness that came from having repeated the same sentence many times that day and knowing it had never once been received kindly. She said the previous authorization had expired, that the insurance company had just reclassified the medication into a category requiring special approval, that the request for renewed authorization had been denied, and that if the family wanted to appeal, the process would take 6 to 8 weeks. Maren asked what would happen to next month's medication while the appeal was pending. The young woman on the other end went silent for a moment, then said that if the family wanted to receive it on time, they would have to pay the full cost themselves. Maren thanked her, said she understood, and ended the call. Then she stood there facing the window overlooking the parking lot and began calculating. She did it quickly, because she had run these numbers so many times that they already lived inside her head like an old song. The combined wages from both jobs, the rent, the electricity, the bus fare, the amount left in the savings account she had started building before her son had even learned to walk, an account that still hadn't managed to reach 4 figures. She added, subtracted, then added everything again as though the answer might somehow change this time. It didn't. She stood there for a few more seconds, pressed 2 fingers to the corners of her eyes, took a breath, then slipped the phone back into her pocket. After that, she turned around, pushed open the waiting room door, and walked inside wearing an entirely different face. Beck was sitting cross-legged on the rug in the corner of the children's waiting area, surrounded by a pile of colored plastic pieces, his legs stretched out in front of him, the tip of his tongue showing slightly at one side of his mouth because he was concentrating so hard. He looked up when he saw his mother and lifted something high with both hands, shouting that he had finished the wing, that this was the right wing, and that the right wing was harder than the left because it had 3 more pieces. Maren sat down on the floor beside him, took the wing, turned it beneath the light, and told him he had built it better than the one printed on the box. Beck burst out laughing, the kind of laughter children give when someone praises the exact thing they are proud of. And then he launched into a long explanation of why airplanes needed 2 wings instead of 1, while Maren nodded, asked him a few questions, and sat there with him among the scattered plastic pieces, until the nurse called his name. Outside, across the parking lot, Elias sat in the black car with the window lowered halfway. He had seen everything. He had seen her standing by the hallway window with the phone pressed to her ear, seen her shoulders sink slightly before straightening again, seen her press her fingers to the corners of her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, and then seen her push open the door, walk back into the room, and smile. He didn't get out of the car. He sat motionless with both hands resting on the steering wheel, and he stayed that way until mother and son disappeared farther inside. That evening he came to the 5th-floor apartment. Beck was already asleep. The paper calendar had been taken down from the refrigerator and laid flat on the kitchen table, and beside it sat the 7-compartment plastic pill organizer, already filled for the week ahead. Elias said nothing about having been in the parking lot. He took a check from inside his coat, already filled out and folded in half, and slid it across the table toward her. Maren looked down at the paper but didn't open it. She sat still for a while with both hands in her lap, then used 2 fingers to push it slowly back across the table until it rested neatly in front of him. She said that if he paid the money, then all of this would immediately become an act of kindness. She said it wasn't kindness. It was a debt, and a debt had to be repaid to the right person and in the right way, not settled by buying someone off and calling it finished. She said she hadn't gone looking for him to ask for money to treat her son, because if she had, then her grandmother had stood outside that hospital door for absolutely nothing. Elias picked up the check, looked at it for a moment, then slipped it back into his coat. He didn't argue. He only asked how much time she had before the next supply of medication was due. She said 11 days. 2 days later, they had to return to Ruth Abernathy's office to sign the authorization papers, and by the time they were on their way back, night had already fallen. Elias chose the bridge because it was quieter than the route that curved around downtown. Maren sat in the passenger seat with the envelope containing the original documents resting on her lap, both hands pressed over it, and she was telling him how Mrs. Roz had taught Beck that day to fold a paper airplane from a grocery store advertisement. She was halfway through the story when Elias glanced into the rearview mirror and stopped speaking. A car had been following them through 3 traffic lights, maintaining the same distance, never passing even when the road opened ahead. When they reached the rising stretch near the middle of the bridge, a second car moved up alongside them from the left lane and matched their speed exactly. And in that moment, Elias understood that no one was trying to chase him. They were trying to force him to stop. He said only one thing, telling her to get down and hold on to the envelope. Maren ducked. The car on the left began crowding them. Metal scraped against metal, a long, dry sound dragging along the entire side of the car, and the steering wheel jerked in Elias's hands. He didn't brake. He eased off the gas for a single beat, just enough for the other car to slide half a length ahead, then turned hard to the right and shoved back against it. And this time, the impact was shorter, sharper, and the car on the left swerved toward the center divider of the bridge. The car behind them immediately surged forward and struck the right rear corner. The entire vehicle twisted sideways, the streetlights streaking across the windshield in one long ribbon of yellow, and for half a second Maren saw the whole black surface of the water below the bridge railing slide across the window beside her. Then she heard the engine roar. Elias didn't try to force the car straight. He let it spin, and he moved with it, turning the wheel into the skid instead of fighting it. And when the front of the car finally pointed toward the narrow opening between the other 2 vehicles, he pressed the accelerator all the way down. The black car lunged forward, shot through the gap, clipped the rear bumper of the car on the left one last time, and broke free. Elias didn't look in the mirror. He kept his foot down through the descending stretch of the bridge, cut across 2 lanes at the bottom, turned onto a narrow tree-lined street, switched off the headlights, drove another 2 blocks, then turned again into an alley behind a row of warehouses and pulled over. He shut off the engine. Inside the car, there was only the ticking of the cooling motor and the breathing of 2 people. Maren sat upright. The envelope was still in her hands, her fingers gripping the paper so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She looked over, and Elias was sitting completely still, both hands resting on the steering wheel in exactly the same position as before, his eyes fixed straight ahead through the windshield, and his breathing perfectly normal, not faster, not slower, as if he had just driven through an intersection on a green light. And in that moment, for the first time since the night in the rain behind the diner, Maren felt afraid. Not of the 2 cars, not for him. She was afraid of the man sitting 1 gear shift away from her, the man who had just done something his hands remembered better than his mind did, the man whose every movement had been so smooth that it could only have come from having done it many times before. She asked if he had done this before. Elias didn't answer. He opened the door, walked around to the back to see how badly the side of the car had been crushed, then returned, sat down, and said they hadn't been trying to take the envelope tonight. If they had wanted it, They would have blocked them at the entrance to the bridge, instead of forcing them over in the middle. They wanted him to understand that they knew where he went, who he went with, and what time he went there. Marin asked why he hadn't chased them. He could have. His car was stronger, and he knew where both ends of the bridge led. Elias started the engine, and before shifting into gear, he said the one thing she would remember for a very long time afterward. He said a man left behind on a bridge was only a story in tomorrow morning's newspaper. But a man who had just learned fear and was still whole enough to go home would tell every other man about it, and he would keep telling them for months. He said people often confused punishing one person with changing the way an entire city behaved toward you. Then he turned on the headlights, backed out of the alley, and took her home by another route. The man appeared in the middle of the next morning, and it was the way he appeared that caught Elias's attention. He didn't call ahead. He left his car 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the way, wearing a shirt without a tie, both hands hanging loose at his sides, carrying no briefcase, carrying nothing at all. He stopped at the entrance to the drive and stood there waiting, without ringing the bell, without calling into the house, until someone came out to ask what he wanted. Elias's men searched him right there and found nothing except a wallet, a set of keys, and a phone that had been powered off. He said his name was Sawyer Kessler, and he said he had come because his father told him to. Elias received him in the study at the back of the house, the room with windows overlooking the rear courtyard, and Sable stretched out on the rug beside the door. Sawyer was 41, tall, his shoulders slightly rounded in the way of someone who had spent too many years sitting behind a desk, with the hollowed eyes of a man who hadn't slept enough for too many nights in a row. He sat down without waiting to be invited, and it wasn't because he was rude, it was because he was tired. He went straight to the point, without any preamble. He said his father wanted to settle this outside every official record. There was money involved, a very large amount of money, enough to cover every medical expense for the child until he turned 18 and still leave plenty over. And in exchange, the tin box would be treated as though it had never been opened. He added that the money wasn't the only term. The other side was prepared to put Ezra Fenn's name on a memorial plaque in the company lobby, with a ceremony, local press, and even a small scholarship fund named after him. Sawyer said it all, in the flat voice of someone repeating another man's words, and when he finished, he looked down at the tabletop instead of at Elias. Elias asked why his father had sent him instead of another lawyer. Sawyer said because he was his son, and because his father believed family matters should be carried by someone in the family. Then he added, more quietly, that he hadn't worked for the company in 3 years, but a surname wasn't something a man could simply leave behind. Elias didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, because he had learned long ago that people often revealed more while waiting than they ever did while being questioned. In that silence, Sawyer's eyes wandered around the room in the way of someone searching for somewhere safe to look, and they stopped at a side table against the wall. On it lay an enlarged print made from the 6th frame of the negatives, the one showing the storefront, the man in the short-sleeved lab coat, and the skinny teenage boy carrying a box. Sawyer looked at it. Then he looked at it a little longer, and something in him changed completely, not in the way of someone startled. His shoulders didn't move, his hands didn't twitch, but the flat expression of a man reciting someone else's message disappeared from his face, and what remained was the face of a man who had just seen the one thing he had spent years trying not to think about. He stood, took 2 steps toward the side table, leaned down for a closer look, and touched the edge of the photograph without picking it up. Elias asked if he knew the people in the picture. Sawyer didn't answer that question. He straightened, turned back toward Elias, and said exactly one sentence. He said, "Your younger sister once came to see me." Then he stopped. He didn't add another word. No explanation, no story, no detail to clarify the sentence that had just fallen into the middle of the room. Elias rose from his chair. Sable lifted her head from the rug. For a long stretch, no one spoke, and Sawyer stood there with both hands hanging at his sides, his face gone pale, the kind of pallor that came over someone who had just said something he himself hadn't been sure he was going to say until it was already out of his mouth. Elias asked again, slowly, one word at a time. "What did you just say?" Sawyer shook his head. He said he couldn't talk about it here, couldn't talk about it today, and he needed to go get something first. He said there was a box he had kept all these years and had never once opened, and he would bring it back. Then he walked toward the door, stopped at the threshold, turned around, and said one last thing, that as far as his father's money was concerned, Elias could consider it as though Sawyer had never brought the offer there at all. Then he walked out beneath the sunlight and headed back toward the car parked 2 blocks away, leaving behind a name no one had dared speak inside that house for 12 years. There was a safe deposit box at the old bank branch on Weybosset Street that his father had left behind, and through all those years Elias had paid the annual maintenance fee without opening it even once. He had always assumed it held emergency cash, or a few bonds, or something a man of his father's generation would put away because he didn't trust banks, yet somehow couldn't think of anywhere safer than a bank to hide it. Elias went there that very afternoon, after Sawyer Kessler left. They took him down to the basement, opened the first lock with the bank's key, then left him alone in a small room with a steel table and an overhead light. Elias inserted his own key, turned it, and pulled the box out. There was no money, not a single bill. Inside were only 2 things, both arranged neatly, as though the person who had put them there had considered the order carefully before closing the lid. The first was a bundle of envelopes, held together with a rubber band, perhaps 20 of them, and every one was a letter that had been sent out and returned. Elias went through them one by one. They had been mailed to places he never would have expected. A newspaper office in Boston, a professional board in the pharmaceutical industry, a state inspector's office, a non-profit organization devoted to transparency in medical data. Every envelope carried a return mark. Some had come back because there was no recipient at the address, some because the address had changed, and some bore only a stamp saying delivery had been refused without giving any reason. They had been sent across different seasons, not concentrated around any single period, like a man who every few months sat down and wrote another letter, put a stamp on it, walked to a mailbox, then received it back untouched a few weeks later, only to sit down and write another one. None of the letters had been opened after they were returned. They were still sealed. The second item was a hardbound notebook with a moss green cover, the kind sold for a few dollars in an office supply store, its spine already coming apart and repaired with tape. Elias opened it and immediately recognized his father's handwriting, letters leaning to the right, written in ballpoint ink, pressed so hard that the impressions rose through the backs of the pages. On every page was a name. Beneath each name were dates, an address, the name of a compound or a process, and the name of a law office. 7 pages, 7 names. Elias read each page slowly. The first was Ezra Fenn, and beneath that name his father had added one short sentence that belonged to no system of record-keeping, a line containing only 4 words. He was good to me. The next 6 pages held 6 names Elias had never heard before, names that sounded as though they belonged to people who had come from somewhere else. 1 Portuguese, 1 Polish, 1 woman whose name carried a note saying she had worked in a laboratory in Fall River. 6 people, 6 formulas, 6 law offices, and on 4 of those 6 pages, the same name appeared on the final line, the name of Warren Kessler's father. Elias turned to the 8th page. It was completely different. There was no address, no compound, no law office. There were only 2 lines. The first was a name written in capital letters, and Elias had seen that name on a gravestone, on the printed thank you cards sent after the funeral, on the necklace his mother wore until the day she died, June Marchetti. The second line beneath it was a date, not her birthday, not the day she died. It was exactly 9 days before her death, and beside it his father had written 4 words. The girl knew already. Elias didn't turn another page. There was nothing left to turn. The rest of the notebook was blank. He stood there in that small room beneath the bank, under the overhead light, with the notebook open on the steel table, and he didn't move. For 12 years he had lived with a story. That story had a wet road, a curve, a phone call before dawn, and a sentence people repeated to him so many times that eventually he stopped hearing it, that it had been an accident, that there was nothing anyone could have done, that sometimes things simply happened. He had believed that story not because it convinced him, but because he had nothing else to put in its place. Now he did, and he realized that for the past 12 years, every time he stepped across the marble threshold of the pharmacy on Atwell Street, every time he sat down at the dining table beneath the oil portrait, every time he signed his name at the bottom of a contract, he had been doing the very thing his sister had died refusing to do. He bent over, closed the notebook with both hands, very slowly, and held it against the tabletop for a long while. Then he slipped both the bundle of letters and the notebook inside his coat, pushed the empty box back into its compartment, locked it, and walked upstairs. When he reached the sidewalk, He stood in the afternoon sunlight for a while before getting into his car. The bank doorman greeted him. Elias nodded in return. Then he drove home, and during the entire ride, he didn't turn on the radio, didn't call anyone, and didn't say a single word. Elias called Augie the following evening and told him to come for dinner. Just the two of them, in the smaller dining room at the back of the house, instead of the main dining room with the portrait. Elias cooked the meal himself. It wasn't something he often did, and Augie said as much when he walked in, telling him the last time he had cooked was when his mother was still alive and he had burned the entire pot. Elias laughed, poured wine into 2 glasses, and slid one across the table. They ate pasta with a tomato sauce that had simmered for hours, the kind their grandmother used to make on Sundays, and for the first half hour, they talked exactly the way the two of them had talked for the past 15 years. Augie told him his oldest son had just failed his driving test for the 2nd time because he still couldn't back into a parking space. Elias asked if he remembered when Elias was 16, when Augie drove him out to the empty lot behind the old factory one Sunday afternoon and made him practice backing between 2 oil drums for 4 straight hours until it was completely dark. Augie laughed and said Elias had knocked over the barrel on the left 11 times, and that he had been forced to buy the old gatekeeper a case of beer so the man wouldn't tell Elias's father. Elias said he remembered. He said he could still remember the smell inside that car, cigarettes and the vinyl seats heated by the sun. He said that through his entire adolescence, the person who had taught him the most wasn't his father. Augie went quiet for a moment, then said his father had been busy. Elias said yes, he had been busy. Then he poured more wine for both of them, set the bottle down, and reached into the drawer of the cabinet beside the dining table for the moss green notebook. He placed it on the table between their half-finished plates and opened it directly to the 8th page. Then he turned the notebook around so it faced Augie squarely. Augie looked down. He didn't pick it up. Elias asked a single question, his voice still as calm as when they had been talking about driving tests, saying that you sat in the 2nd row at her funeral. You remember that, don't you? Augie put down his fork. The silence stretched long enough for them to hear the refrigerator running in the next room. Then he said he remembered. He said he remembered the color of the flowers, remembered how bright the sun had been that day, bright enough to make everyone squint, remembered getting up in the middle of the service and walking into the hallway because he couldn't sit there any longer. Then he began to speak, and once he started, the words came without stopping, like a man who had rehearsed the story in his head through 1,000 sleepless nights. He said he had been the one driving that night. She had called him late in the evening and told him to take her to Boston, not to ask any questions, and he had done it. During the drive, she clutched a canvas bag against herself and refused to say what was inside. She told him she was going to give it to someone, and after that everything in the family would be different. He said he stopped at a gas station halfway out of the city, stood beside the pump, and made a phone call. He said he hadn't called anyone because he wanted her hurt. He had called the person everyone in the family called whenever there was trouble, the man who always knew how to make things settle down. And he had said, word for word, that the girl was about to do something foolish, talk some sense into her. He said that when he hung up the phone, he had actually felt relieved, because he believed he had just stopped a 19-year-old younger sister from destroying her life. Augie stopped. Then he said that 9 days later there had been a funeral, and from that day until now he had never slept through an entire night. Elias didn't ask for another detail. He didn't ask what happened after that phone call, who had done what, or where. He sat still, looking down at the table. Augie continued, his voice beginning to break, saying that the call had been recorded, and Warren Kessler had kept that recording all these years, and every few years he brought it up again, never as a threat, only as a reminder, exactly the way someone might remind an old friend about a debt that had been sitting unpaid for a very long time. He said everything he had done for Kessler since then had begun with those 30 seconds at the gas station. He said even the sheet of paper with that girl's work schedule, the one he had sat down and written in his own handwriting, had begun with those same 30 seconds. Then he looked up at Elias and said he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He said, you can do whatever you want with me, and I've been waiting for this moment longer than you have. Elias stood. He walked around the table, and Augie closed his eyes, but Elias only stopped beside his chair, bent down, picked up the notebook, closed it, and held it in one hand. Then he spoke. He said nothing was going to happen to him. His wife would keep the house, his children would stay in school, and no one in this city would touch him. But from tonight on, Elias said, you are no longer family. No one among us will take your calls. No one will sit at a table with you. If you call, no one will answer. If you come here, the door will not open. And in every story anyone tells about this family after I am dead, your name will not be in it. He said that was exactly what his grandfather had done to a man in a hospital room many years ago, and that only now did he understand why it was the harshest punishment one human being could devise for another. Then he opened the dining room door. Augie remained seated for a few more seconds with his hands resting on either side of his plate. Then he stood and walked out, and neither man said another word. The first blow came through the mail, and it arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. A thick envelope, sent by certified mail, signature required, and inside was a copy of a petition for reconsideration of child custody that had already been filed in family court. The petitioner was Beck's biological father, a man named Colby Rowe, whom Marin hadn't seen in more than 5 years and had only heard through a mutual acquaintance, was living in the southern part of the state. The petition stated that the mother was currently maintaining regular contact with an individual who had a history connected to organized criminal activity, that the child was living in an unsafe environment, and that the father was requesting a full review of the custody arrangement. Attached were 3 photographs, taken from a distance. One showed the black car parked in front of the building, one showed Elias walking up the steps, and one showed the 2 of them leaving Ruth Abernathy's office. Ruth read the entire petition, set it down, and said the filing itself wasn't particularly dangerous because of what it claimed, but it was dangerous because of when it had been filed, exactly 9 days after Sawyer Kessler first stepped into Elias's house. She said a man who hadn't appeared in 5 years didn't suddenly hire an attorney at a firm with offices overlooking the bay by accident. Then she went on, and this was the part she had already been holding for 2 days without wanting to say yet. She said she had traced the Fenn family's vital records to prepare the section establishing legal standing, and she had found something. Dorothy Fenn wasn't related to Ezra Fenn by blood. She took the surname later, after his death, when she filed a legal name change through the county court. And on the name change record, the reason was written very simply, to preserve the name of a family that had no one left. Ruth said it plainly, without softening it, that legally Marin wasn't Ezra Fenn's heir, had no blood relationship to him, and had no standing to reclaim anything that had belonged to him. Marin sat quietly and listened. She didn't cry. She asked only one question. What about my grandmother's signature? Ruth said that was something different, and it was the only thing they had left. That night, at the Federal Hill estate, the power went out close to midnight. Not the whole neighborhood, only that house, and Elias understood immediately what it meant. He was on the 2nd floor when he heard Sable downstairs, not barking, but making a low, steady growl. The sound the dog only made when she heard someone where no one was supposed to be. Elias went down the stairs in the dark. The study door was open. A flashlight beam swept across the wall. Metal struck the face of a cabinet, and 2 men were crouched in front of the wall safe. Sable lunged ahead of him. A chair crashed over. Shoes slid across the wooden floor, and someone slammed a shoulder into the doorframe. Elias caught one man by the collar and yanked him backward, while the other dropped the flashlight and ran toward a window that had already been opened. The whole thing lasted only moments, and when the lights came back on, all that remained in the room was a wool cap on the floor, the flashlight still glowing beneath the desk, and the safe still closed, because what they had come looking for hadn't been inside it for days. Elias sat down among the papers that had been pulled from the drawers and began gathering them back up. Among them was a stack of unopened mail, the kind he let pile up for months before throwing it away unread. Donation requests, advertisements, things sent to the Marchetti name simply because it was the Marchetti name. And in the middle of that stack was a thick envelope, handwritten in neat script, addressed to him by his full name. Elias looked at the postmark. It had been sent weeks before the rainy night in the parking lot behind the diner. He held it in his hands for a long time before opening it. Inside was a copy of the black and white photograph, a copy of the patent application, and a 3-page handwritten letter that began by saying she knew he didn't know her and had no reason to read all of this. She had knocked on his door before he even knew she existed, and he hadn't opened it. The next morning, he went to the 5th-floor apartment and found the door standing slightly open, 2 canvas bags resting on the hallway floor, and Marin rolling up her son's blanket. She said Beck was downstairs with Mrs. Roz, watching cartoons and eating cookies, that he knew nothing, and that she wasn't going to let him know anything. She said she had an old friend in Vermont. She said she had spent the entire night thinking, and had realized that as long as she stayed close to Elias, that petition would keep carrying weight. And if she disappeared from the city, they would no longer have a reason to drag her son into it. She said Dot had stayed silent for 40 years and had still managed to live, and Marin would manage too. Then she picked up the bags and headed for the door. Elias stopped her at the top of the stairs. He didn't grab the bag away from her. He simply stood there, held out the 3-page letter she herself had written weeks earlier, and told her he had finally read it the night before. He said that on the last page she had written that she didn't need anyone to save her. She only needed someone willing to read all the way to the end. He said he hadn't read it, and he had nearly put her on a bus out of the city without even knowing her face. Then he said that now he had read it, and she could leave if she wanted, but she wouldn't leave alone. And he wasn't going to let her do what her grandmother had done for 40 years. Marin stood motionless on the stair with the bag in her hand. Then she set it down. She didn't say anything. She simply stepped forward once and rested her forehead against his shoulder, and Elias lifted one hand to cradle the back of her neck. And the two of them stood that way for a very long time in the dim hallway, between the 2 canvas bags and the faint sound of cartoons drifting up from the floor below. 3 nights later, in the 5th floor kitchen, Marin was washing dishes close to midnight, while Elias sat at the table with the stack of files Ruth had copied into 3 separate sets. Beck had been asleep for hours. They had spent the entire evening trying to find a way around the wall Warren Kessler had built, and every path kept bringing them back to the same place: that the evidence was strong enough to open a federal investigation, and that such an investigation would immediately suspend the license of the only facility producing the medication. Elias said he had considered stockpiling a reserve supply in advance, and Ruth had rejected the idea immediately, because the drug couldn't be stored for long, and because doing that would make him the one manipulating the supply. Marin listened to all of it without joining in. She simply stood there with her hands in hot water, scrubbing the same pot over and over. Then she turned off the faucet. She stood still for several seconds with soap suds still covering both hands, and said, in the ordinary tone of someone asking whether anyone wanted more tea, that everyone was asking the wrong question. Elias looked up. She dried her hands on a towel, turned around, leaned back against the sink, and said that all evening everyone had been trying to figure out how to protect the factory from the investigation. She said there was no need to protect it. She said the problem wasn't that the factory would be suspended. The problem was that those 2,300 people would have nowhere else to get the medication when it was. She said then give them somewhere else first. Elias asked exactly what she meant. Marin said she worked in a contract laboratory, and she had typed hundreds of technology transfer files for companies that sent samples there, and she knew what that process looked like. She said no one had to destroy the patent. They only had to transfer it. Transfer everything: the intellectual property rights, the manufacturing process, the testing records, the raw material supplier lists. Hand all of it over to a non-profit organization capable of receiving it, and do it first. Finish it. Let the ink dry on every document. She said when the investigation broke and Kessler's production line was sealed, the medication would no longer belong to Kessler. It would already be somewhere else, under another name, operated by someone else. She said then they could investigate for as long as they wanted, and no child would have to wait. Elias sat silent for a very long time. Then he said the part she hadn't said aloud, that doing this would require him to sign away the entire pharmaceutical division, which meant nearly all the legitimate assets his family name still held, and he wouldn't receive a single dollar in return, because if he did, it would no longer be a transfer. It would look like a fire sale, ahead of an investigation. Marin said she knew. She said she had thought about that before opening her mouth, and that was why she had spent 10 minutes scrubbing the same pot. Then she added that she wouldn't be angry if he refused. Elias stood, walked over to the sink, and said that all his life, people had only taught him how to keep things. Keep the land, keep the name, keep the contracts, keep whatever other people had taken, and then handed down to him to keep holding. He said no one had ever taught him how to return something to the place where it belonged, and maybe that was why it had taken him 36 years to end up standing in this kitchen. The next morning, he drove an hour south through the state, to a 2-story rental building behind an auto parts store, and knocked on the door of apartment number 4. Colby Rowe opened the door and recognized him immediately, and the man didn't close it, didn't deny anything, didn't call anyone. He simply stood there with a cleaning rag still in one hand and said, "I knew someone would come eventually." Elias didn't threaten him once. He sat down on a plastic chair in the small kitchen and asked how much he had been paid. Colby told him the amount, and it wasn't as large as Elias had expected. Then he said he had almost refused it, that he had held that petition in his hands for 3 days. And then the man began to cry, right there in the middle of the kitchen. The silent kind of crying that came from a man in his 30s who wasn't used to crying in front of strangers. He said he hadn't left because he stopped caring. He said that winter, when someone sat the two of them down and told them the name of the disease and the monthly cost of the medication, he had sat in the hospital hallway and understood that he would never be able to earn that kind of money. Not that year, not 10 years later, never. He said he couldn't bear waking up every morning and looking at his wife and child while knowing he was that useless. So he had done the most cowardly thing a person could do. He had walked out the door. He said there hadn't been a single day in the past 5 years when he hadn't thought about it. Elias let him finish crying. Then he said the boy was doing all right, that he could build model airplanes better than the instructions printed on the box, and that he knew which dinosaur had 3 horns. Colby Rowe withdrew the petition that same afternoon. Sawyer Kessler came back 4 days later, and this time he brought the box he had mentioned. There weren't any files inside. There was only a single sheet of paper, folded in half, written by June herself, and on it were 7 names with 7 addresses, people she had managed to trace during the final months of her life, people who were still alive and had been present in those offices back then. Sawyer said she had given it to him and asked him to keep it in case something happened. He said he had kept it all these years without opening it once, because opening it would have meant having to do something, and he hadn't been brave enough. Elias and Ruth went looking for all 7 people. 6 refused. 1 shut the door the moment he heard the name Kessler. 1 invited them inside, poured them water, sat there crying, and still shook her head. 1 said plainly that he was 80 years old now, and asked them to leave him alone. The 7th was named Adelaide Vaughn, 84 years old, living in a senior apartment complex in Cranston, and she had once worked as a typist in the old law office. Ruth hadn't even finished her 3rd sentence when Adelaide stood up and went to get her glasses. She said she remembered the afternoon someone handed her a declaration and told her to retype it, and she had asked why 1 line had been removed, and they told her simply to type what she had been given. She said she remembered the name that had been left out because she had typed it in the earlier version and had been forced to retype the entire page. She said she had been waiting for this almost all her life, and she had started to believe she would die before anyone ever came to ask. She sat in front of Ruth's camera in the small living room with lace curtains, both hands resting neatly in her lap, and she told them everything. The company-wide meeting at headquarters took place on a Thursday morning in the ground floor auditorium, with more than 200 employees filling every seat and 4 cameras positioned in the 4 corners because the communications department had scheduled documentary footage weeks in advance. On the podium was a prepared speech inside a leather folder. Elias stepped up, opened the folder, looked at it for a few seconds, then closed it and pushed it aside. From the inside pocket of his coat, he took out a sheet of paper browned along the folds. He said he was going to read a letter, that it had been written inside a house everyone there knew, the house on Atwell Street whose image the company still printed on every brochure, and that it had been written by the true owner of that house. Then he read. He read slowly, from beginning to end, without leaving out a single line, and throughout it the auditorium was so quiet that the hum of the projector could be heard. He reached the part where the writer said he wasn't afraid of dying, only afraid his name would disappear before he did. And Elias's voice didn't shake, but he had to stop for a moment before continuing. When he finished, he folded the letter and said 3 things. First, the foundational patent behind the company's flagship product would be formally corrected to restore both inventors' names, Ezra Fenn and Dorothy Fenn, and the second was a woman who had worked as a laboratory assistant and had been removed from the record because she had no degree and because she was a woman. Second, the entire plant, production line, manufacturing process, and intellectual property connected to that product had already been transferred unconditionally to a non-profit organization. The paperwork had been completed the week before, and the company would not receive a single dollar in return. Third, the full records concerning 7 cases had been submitted to federal prosecutors that very morning. There was the scrape of a chair. Warren Kessler stood from the 3rd row, fastened the button of his suit jacket, and walked out through the silence of 200 people. At the door, he stopped. He didn't turn all the way around, only angled his head enough, and he said loudly enough for the entire auditorium to hear that he had never believed he was doing something wrong. He said he had simply never stopped. Then he said that Elias still had time, and that was something he himself had run out of a long time ago. Then he left. 3 weeks later, Elias Marchetti sat inside a windowless conference room in the Federal Building at Kennedy Plaza and signed a cooperation agreement, 31 pages long. He turned over books, names, routes, accounts, and even things no one had asked for. He agreed to years of financial oversight, agreed to the seizure of most assets whose origins couldn't be documented, agreed that the Marchetti name would appear in newspapers in exactly the way his father and grandfather had spent their entire lives trying to avoid. Ruth sat beside him throughout the meeting and intervened only twice. When they reached the hallway afterward, she said she had spent 17 years sitting on the other side of that table and had never seen anyone sign so quickly. Elias said it had taken him 12 years to finish reading one line in his father's notebook, so 31 pages really didn't seem all that long. Many seasons later, the house on Atwell Street opened its doors again, but it was no longer a pharmacy. The newspapers covering the inside of the windows were taken down. The doorframe was repainted, and a sign was hung saying that this was now a community clinic, offering free care 3 days a week, with priority given to people without insurance. On opening morning, Elias arrived before the sky was fully light, alone, carrying a bucket of mortar and a trowel. The marble slab was still lying tilted beside the entrance from the night he had pried it up, covered with dust and a few dry leaves. He swept the surface clean, spread the mortar, then lowered the stone back into its original place, adjusted it until both edges aligned with the doorway, and pressed the heel of his shoe gently into the boat-shaped hollow in the middle until the slab sat firmly. He didn't put it back to erase what had happened. He put it back because that stone had been there before his grandfather, and it would still be there after everyone connected to this story was gone. Then he stood, stepped back once, and looked at the small brass plaque mounted to the left of the door. There were 2 names on it: Ezra Fenn, Dorothy Fenn. Beneath them there were no titles, no logo, no line mentioning the company or who had paid for the plaque. Only one short sentence, saying that this place had once been their workplace. Elias stood there for quite a while in the gray light of early morning, both hands still stained with mortar, and he didn't say a word. As for Augie, Elias only heard about him through other people, that he had sold his house and moved to another state, that he was managing a warehouse and still went to work every day. No one in the family called him, and he didn't call anyone either. That afternoon the sun was out, and at the Riverside Park there was a man in his 30s, sitting on a stone bench beside a little boy, both of them holding ice cream cones. While the man tried to explain something by drawing shapes in the air with his hands, Beck burst out laughing because his father's ice cream was running down his sleeve. Then the boy ran to the concession stand for a napkin, came back, and made his father wipe it off. Marin sat on a bench farther away, watching the 2 of them, and she didn't go over. She let them have that afternoon. The following weekend, on the grass behind the clinic, Beck stood in the sunlight and threw a yellow plastic disc for Sable. The dog charged after it, misjudged where it would land, snapped at empty air, then turned back with an expression that made it seem as though the disc itself had been at fault. The boy exploded into laughter, laughing so hard he had to bend over with both hands on his knees, then picked up the disc and threw it again. Marin sat on the marble step by the back door, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching her son and laughing along without even realizing she was laughing. Elias came outside carrying 2 cups of coffee, handed one to her, then sat down beside her on that same stone. They didn't speak for a long while. It was the kind of silence 2 people could only have after traveling together through a stretch of road. Neither had been certain they would survive. Then Beck came running over, breathing hard, his hair stuck to his forehead, the plastic disc tucked beneath one arm, and asked if Elias was staying for dinner. Elias looked at the boy, then at the woman sitting beside him, and answered in 3 words: "I'm staying tonight." There are things time doesn't heal on its own, and there are names that, if no one is willing to speak them again, truly do disappear, disappearing even faster than the people who once carried them. A person's worth doesn't depend on whether their name is carved somewhere, but those who remain alive always carry the responsibility of carving it back in, even when doing so costs them the very thing they themselves have been standing upon. And sometimes, the greatest kindness a life can leave behind isn't building something new, but having the courage to return something to the place where it always belonged. If today's story touched something in you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with someone you believe needs to hear it, so that each day we can bring you more stories worth stopping to listen to. How did this story make you feel? And what part of it stayed with you the longest? Please leave a comment below, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and the people you love always have good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, take care, and we'll see you again in the next video.